Good afternoon. Today we're going to talk about creating a safe and supportive environment for ELLs, or English language learners. So, who can tell me, what is an ELL, or an English language learner?
Well, it's a secondary school student who's still trying to learn English.
Yes, very good. So an English language learner is exactly that, someone who's learning English, and specifically in K through 12. So what are their rights? What do you think? What are some rights that our ELL students have?
They have a right to an equal education.
Yeah, that's very good. They do. They have a right to equal education.
I think adding on to that, they have a right to be in the classroom whether or not they're here legally.
Right. They have a right to be in the classroom regardless of how they got here.
I would think they would have the right to be given services to get a fair opportunity. So a service for them to learn the English language better.
Exactly, right. They have rights to learn English, they have rights to an equal education, and they have a right to be in your classroom regardless of how they got here. So Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 prohibits discrimination on the basis of race, color, or other national origin in education. And so some other ways that are interesting to note that our students would be discriminated against are if we don't provide information to their parents in a language that they can understand. So it's important as teachers that we should also understand some of these parents' cultures. They may not be comfortable to come to you and ask you, how is my child doing? So it's very important that you make them aware of these rights, aware of their rights to talk to you, and also try and make them feel comfortable to do so. So what does it feel like to be an ELL? Would any of you consider yourselves ELLs today?
No.
No. So if you could try and put yourself in their shoes, what might make you, if you were an ELL, feel unsafe, unsupported, or negative? What are some ways that you might feel unsafe, unsupported, or negative?
Socially, as your peers are talking to each other and you trying to process the information as they keep going back and forth, it may be really tough to converse with them.
Yeah, there's a lot of social pressure and hard to make friends, perhaps.
I think if the teacher struggled understanding me with the language, or just couldn't really communicate like the lessons to me well, I think I would feel lost.
Right, so an inability to communicate with your professor, right, or your teacher.
Yeah, I think if you can't understand the professor or the coursework, it would be really frustrating.
Right, right.
Because even if you are an intelligent person, you can't understand the language.
Sure, yeah, having this kind of perception that because I can't speak the language, maybe I'm perceived as not as smart or not as intelligent, sure. Any other ways?
Isolation would be tough also.
Mm.
You know, if you were just one person all by yourself in this little world.
Sure, yeah.
That would be tough.
If the teacher asks their questions and they call on their students right away, I would feel the ELL student would feel like so uncomfortable because it takes them an extra second or two to process everything. And also, if the teacher doesn't write down directions, it may hurt them from understanding what's going on.
Yeah, there's a lot of pressure to perform the same way that your peers are performing. Yeah, those are all really good. Also, what might make the parent of an ELL feel these same kind of emotions, unsafe, unsupported, or negative? So try and imagine you're a parent of a student who's learning another language, and how might you feel unsafe, unsupported, or negative?
I think it would be pretty intimidating to even contact the teacher through email or something if you're not confident in your writing abilities.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, that's true, right? It's important. They may not speak English, and that might instantly make it more difficult for them.
If their child comes home every day feeling down or feel that the school isn't providing enough services to work at the same level as their classmates, I could see that really affecting the parents.
Yeah, absolutely, right. Your kid comes home every day and is struggling. It's hard.
I think if the parent felt culturally separate from American culture, in general, I think going into a school environment that was very Americanized would feel strange, and maybe you'd feel like an outsider.
That's an excellent point, and I'm going to focus a lot on that today. And a lot of these difficulties that ELLs and their parents are feeling has a lot to do with a cultural separation and not feeling understood or not being communicated well with. Anything else that might make you feel unsafe?
Well, I think especially in the PTA and after school activities, if the other parents don't include you and incorporate you in like chain mails or group meetings, you wouldn't be able to support your child as well through the extracurriculars.
Right, yeah, there's that isolation there, right? So that's a good point too, because it's not always from the teacher, but other parents of other students may also increase those feelings of isolation. Very good. So I'm going to try something. I have an activity planned, and I want to put you in the shoes of an ELL for just a moment or a couple of minutes. Hopefully this will help you to understand what does it really feel like to be an ELL. So are you ready?
Yes.
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay. So I'm going to teach you something called the is dialect, and this is borrowed from Lisa Delpit. And so what you basically do is add the phonetic element is after the first consonant or consonant cluster in each syllable of a word. So that's a wordy definition, but look at some examples. So teacher becomes tizzy chizer. And if it starts with a vowel, then you put an is in the beginning. So apple becomes is a pizzle. So maybe we can just try and read those two together. So teacher, let's read tizzy chizer. Okay? And apple is a pizzle. Do you think you get it?
Yeah.
Do you need some more clarification? So it's just basically in between each consonant of the word, you're going to add this element is. So let's just try it on this word, dog. What does dog change to? What do you think? Dizog. Yeah, see, you got it, right? So let's look at that. Dizog. Can you repeat after me? Dizog.
Dizog.
Okay, and how about the next one? Berry.
Bizarre.
Yeah, good, you got it. Bizarrizy. So let's read that one together. Ready? Bizarrizy. And maybe a little faster. Bizarrizy. Okay. What about student? Let me try that one. Whenever you're ready. Yeah, you got it. It's a little slow, but you've got it. So stizudizent. So let's do that together. Stizudizent. Okay, very good. Okay, got it?
Mm-hmm.
Think we're ready?
Yeah.
All right, so I'm going to ask a question in the is dialect to someone, and you just try your best to answer in that dialect, okay? So I'm just going to move on. It's not going to be up here. Just listen. Okay, so Dean, I have a question for you. Wizat dizu, yizu dizu, is in yizor frazi tizayim.
Izu dizon nizon.
Wizat?
Trying to say I don't know.
I see. Can anyone help him out? Can I have a volunteer?
Sure.
You volunteer? I'm going to ask you a different question,
Okay.
actually. So thank you for volunteering.
All right.
If is yizu hizad mizor frizi tizayim, wizat wizud yizu dizu.
Izai wizud spizend mizor tizim rezai tizing.
Gizud. Okay, good. Does anyone else want to give a volunteer? No more volunteers.
No way.
That's shocking. Okay, no more volunteers. Are you sure? What if I put it on the board? Can someone volunteer for the next one? Does this help? Can I get a volunteer for the next question? Was that fizud zizar hizel fizi fizor yizu? Can I have a volunteer for this one? A volunteer, Lauren. Thank you.
Oh no.
Oh, no.
Says is it?
Very good. Okay, thank you. Thank you. All right, very good. Okay. All right, the next one, I would like you actually to write this one down, but please write in the is dialect, okay? So the next question is, wizat is, yizor fize vizor rizit, hizal izid dize. Please write it down.
Just write our response.
Yes, please. In the is dialect. Okay, are we all finished? Does someone want to volunteer and share their answer that they wrote down? Evan?
Mizai fize vizor rezit hizal izid dize is hizal izo wazin.
Okay, very good. You may have missed a is after the W, but thank you for volunteering. Any other volunteers? Does anyone want to share their answer? Yeah?
Fizz,
All right, good try. Good try. Thank you for
I
trying.
think I got that one.
Yeah?
Does Anks Gizivizin?
Yeah, that was a little better. Yeah, good. You're getting it. You're getting it. All right.
Getting
Yeah.
it.
Oh, another volunteer. Excellent.
Christizmizus.
Close, but thank you. Thank you for trying. All right. Anyone else want to share? Jack, you want to share yours too?
His all is zo is zizin.
I think you have too many ises, so maybe his was lacking and yours had a little too many, but thank you for sharing. All right, last question. So this time I actually want you to ask your partner this question and then take turns answering each other, okay? So the last question is, Wizai dizu yizu wizant tizu bizi is tizi chizer. So can you please take a moment, ask the person sitting next to you this question, and please answer using only the is dialect.
Oh man. Do you want to go first or shall I?
I'll go first. So.
Okay. Do you want?
I. Liz.
Wizai.
Oh,
first one.
Wizai.
Zo. Bizi.
Wizon. Tizu.
Tizo.
Tiz. Echizer.
Very good,
Bizi.
Lauren. I heard that.
Wizant.
MZ.
All right, good, good,
Tizo.
Chizai.
Tizu. Wizant. Tizu.
Tizu.
Bizi. Izat. Tizi.
Is
Is I was on.
The answer's not there.
No, I'm just trying to read it.
Yeah. All right, why not? Now you can you can exit the is dialect for a second. Now let's just reflect. So what did you think about what just happened?
That was really hard.
Really hard,
Very
yeah.
difficult.
Very difficult.
Particularly when there was no visual for me, I was lost.
Okay, no visual, you were lost. All right, and what else was hard about it? I mean, yes, it was hard, but why? Why was it hard? How did you feel?
Well, in general, speaking is something that comes just naturally, and it became something that was incredibly like laborious. Just to like utter a sentence is like a whole thought process.
Sure, yeah. Dean, it took you a really long time to get the words "I don't know" out, even.
Yeah.
And you weren't even actually giving me an answer. But how were you feeling at that
You
moment?
have to process each syllable in your head, and it takes like a few seconds. And when you say like a sentence, or like everyone was saying, when you talk, it just comes so naturally. So when you're trying to do each syllable, it just comes out like.
It wasn't natural.
No,
right?
definitely not natural.
How many of you were translating in your head, trying to get it into regular English first,
trying, but
and
it
then
doesn't work.
spitting it back out, right? Sure. What else did we notice? Any other observations?
I felt a little uncomfortable when you were talking to me in the is dialect, and I had no idea what you were saying.
Yeah,
It was
yeah.
like I was like a
It's
deer
like,
in the
please don't
headlights.
call
Yeah.
him.
Oh, please.
Yeah.
Don't make eye contact.
Yeah, yeah. Well, thank you, Evan. Evan volunteered, but not many of you wanted to volunteer in the beginning. But when did you all start to volunteer? When did you volunteer?
I think-
You could just tell me. Yeah,
Like when you have it written down in front of you,
Mhm.
because you have the visual, and it's not just you're not just saying something that.
So
you're
that was
thinking
helpful,
in your head.
right?
Yeah.
Having it written down. Suddenly, your confidence shot up.
And when your back was towards us, so when you picked on one of them, we were able to process it on our own and just think for ourselves.
Sure.
When you talked to me directly, it was like so
Pressure's
much things were
on.
scrambling in my mind.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, speaking with your peer is a lot. It can be easier because there's like you said, there's no pressure. You know, you just kind of like, all right, let's figure this out, kind of thing.
So, do you think that the partner part was better than when I was calling on you individually?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, it felt-
Did any of you cheat? Did you not use is dialect communicating with your partner just to sort of vent about what was going on?
A little bit.
Yeah.
Clarify.
And did that make you feel better about what we were doing in any way?
Yep.
Maybe. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. All right. Any other observations? Was there anything good about what just happened? What were some things that I did maybe that were good or bad as a teacher
Well,
that
I
may
think-
have helped or hindered you?
Like you said, having the visual is helpful. So that would be something to keep in mind if you have ELLs in your class.
Absolutely,
But-
right? Just listening, I mean, it's really difficult, right? How many of you really got what I asked him the first time around? And not many, right?
And when you asked it so smoothly, it made you feel like, oh shoot, you have to know it this well. And I could see that in the classroom with the ELL when the teacher speaks so smoothly and fluently that they feel that pressure that they have to do the same.
Right. Yeah. Right. I'm not speaking slowly or hopefully, trying to get it out. So that makes a lot of performance pressure. Sure. Anything else that was particularly good or bad about what we were doing?
I think it was good that although you increased the speed at which you were talking, because you're obviously a little bit more comfortable with it than us. You didn't use, it wasn't too fast, and you didn't use any slang. So I could imagine that it would be very difficult for an ESL if you start using slang.
Yeah,
That's something that doesn't really mean what.
Yeah, if I had introduced a word that wasn't really a word or something,
that would be
and you'd be trying to, I know a lot of people were trying to peek around me so they could see the board, and so that helped a lot, right? What would have helped more? Was there anything that I could have done better just for this activity? Don't think too hard about how this applies to an ELL, but what might have made you feel better just now?
I think kind of a smoother transition into sentence formation, because it went from say dizog and say diseacher to say come up with a whole sentence in your head about how you feel about X, Y, Z.
And that's sort of one of the limitations of this activity, right? I teach you the language and then instantly we're doing an activity in it. But you may think of an ELL learning vocabulary for a particular lesson and then suddenly jumping into a deeper question, and suddenly they're lost, or they're turning to their partner, what did she say, right? So very good. So that went well. So Lisa Delpit did this with some of her graduate students, and she has this quote to say, "During a follow-up discussion, all students invariably speak of the impossibility of attempting to apply rules while trying to formulate and express a thought. Forcing speakers to monitor their language for rules while speaking typically produces silence." Does this resonate with you guys about what just happened, right? I mean, do you feel like your answer to the last question, why do you want to be a teacher? I mean, you probably have a very good answer to that question, but could you produce that in the is dialect? No. You may actually have been searching for a shorter answer to give me just to get it done, right? So it's really a fascinating thing. So one of the things I want to point out, too, is that it's really critical that we give enough wait time. As a teacher, it's sometimes uncomfortable to wait for too long for an answer. But with our ELL students, we have to remember that they're processing in two languages, and they're translating what you said and then translating their answer, just like the way you just felt. And so if you have to wait and have an awkward pause, that's okay. Or there may be other ways that you can help them or increase this wait time. Have them speak to a partner first. Have them write it down first. These are ways that we can increase the wait time in terms of them producing something and making them feel more confident about their response. What kind of things, or just what do you think would hinder the progression of an ELL student in your classroom?
I think having content that's just too difficult for them to understand because of the language barrier, or culturally if they can't relate, in social studies, if they've never learned about George Washington before, and then you're giving them an assignment about this man that they've never heard of, it would be confusing.
So our assumptions about what they already know.
Right.
Yeah, so if you had a student talk about the George Washington's farewell address, but yet he doesn't know who George Washington is, how is he supposed to explain that? So I think holding them to unfair expectations would really hinder them, because you're holding them to these expectations they are not at that level yet, and then they have to process everything, and then they're under that pressure. So I think it would just force a vicious cycle for them to fail.
Okay, sure. So our expectations of them might hinder them. What other things might hinder them based on how you just felt 5 minutes ago? What was hindering you?
I think that probably the speed of progression in the class. Obviously, as a teacher, you need to cover a lot of material, but I think the more, I guess you could say, piles on mentally for these kids, the more they're going to want to give up. If they feel like they're still struggling with a topic or something in the language, and you're already moving on to the next thing and to the next thing, eventually they're like, I can't do this,
Right, not being able to keep up with the pace. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and if the teacher doesn't make accommodations, for example, when you told us the question, it was like we had no idea what was going on, but when you were able to write it down and say it, then it was easier to process. So for like an ELL, I think it would be best definitely to write the directions, say them multiple times so they have like a better chance of understanding what you're saying.
Yeah, I hear a lot of that. Visuals are important, right? Yeah. So, any other?
I think grouping also, like if I was in a group of people who all had a greater understanding than me, and coupled with a high pace, I would feel very intimidated.
Sure.
Whereas
yeah.
if I was in a group of other people who had similar understanding, might feel more at ease and more willing to try before I give up.
Right. So if I had placed you in a classroom of students who all were fluent in is dialect, I mean, how would you feel then, right? Because that's really the experience of our ELLs. They're not sitting in a room with other ELLs in your mainstream classroom. They have to get by at the same pace as the rest of their peers. So I want to talk about anxiety, because I think that is what hinders an ELL more than anything else, is this pressure to perform, pressure to fit in, feeling isolated. And there's a linguist, Stephen Krashen. He does a lot of work in second language acquisition. And he said that unconscious learning language is actually much more effective than if you were to do it in a formal classroom setting. So how many of you have maybe traveled before? Maybe. And what do you think? Did you learn language while you were traveling, or were you kind of more isolated?
Yeah, I learned a little bit of language.
Now, were you in a classroom learning language, or were you just kind of on the streets getting by, or meeting people
just
and
meeting
casual
people,
conversation, right?
talking to them.
So he takes this principle, right, and applies it, and he says, when you're learning a language, you will remember a lot more when you're using it practically, when you're using it in meaning making, more so than learning the grammatical structures. Now, that's not to say that our classrooms are free for all, right? We have to teach grammar, we have to teach vocabulary, and there's a place for that. But for an ELL in your mainstream classroom, it's really important that they practice a lot and that they feel safe to practice a lot. Because if they're not comfortable, their progress is already hindered. So it's really important to have the least stress attached to language learning. And so that also means that we shouldn't overcorrect. We have to be aware of how much, if I were to stop you at each syllable and say, wrong, 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 right, this would just immediately make you feel like, oh, I can't do it anyway. And like Evan pointed out, they would give up. So we need to be aware of this. So these are 3 things that Krashen in his research pointed out that an ELL needs. 1, a comfortable learning environment with a low threshold for anxiety, which is what I just talked about. 2, meaningful tasks that purposefully engage students to learn how to speak, listen, read, and write. So again, meaning making emphasized more than the structure of how they're speaking, depending on your activity. And 3, engagement in tasks that are just a bit beyond the student's current ability. So not asking too much of them. Dean, you mentioned high expectations and how that would just cause them to shut down. And
so for number 3, you're talking about Vygotsky's theory of just not just throwing them into the ocean and telling them to swim, but like guide them.
Yeah, it's similar to that in some sense, right? You want to put them in a place where they can just get it with maybe a little help from a peer or maybe with a little help from the professor, and that's actually the best place. He calls it the zone of proximal development. That's the best place for a student to learn, in that zone. I'm actually not going to focus too much on 2 and 3 today. I want to more pay attention to this first one, a comfortable learning environment, and how important this is. So this is what we're going to focus on today. So what do we do? What are some ways you can think of just off the top of your head? How do you make an ELL feel comfortable in your classroom?
Maybe having books or literature in their home language in the classroom.
Yeah.
So they have some material that they could just pick up and feel comfortable.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a great idea.
I think attitude, just like the general demeanor and the way you carry yourself as a teacher in the class. Like if you have a very I mean, obviously there's still subjects you have to get across, and there's important things you need to cover. But I think having a very colloquial attitude and speaking to the student very openly and making it feel like you said, it's the more comfortable they are, the better. So if you go into class being like, you got to learn this, you got to do this, they're going to feel stressed out. If you're like, listen, we're in this together, we're trying to learn this language, let's do it. Then I feel like it'd be easier for them they feel less pressured.
Right, absolutely. Our attitude is really important, and our environment that we place our students in also.
Yeah, I feel you need to be really positive with them and give the impression that you're there to support the student. Don't make him feel like he's doomed for failure in the classroom. So individualize the way you teach. Don't hold him to the same like an ELL student to the same expectations as others. Rather, just monitor their progress and work towards their own needs.
Great, your answers were excellent, and we're going to touch on a lot of them, actually, a little bit more specifically. So that's us, super teachers, right? So the first thing I want to talk about is creating an environment of respect and rapport. So this means understanding our students and appreciating them, and not looking at them as a term coined by Lisa Delpit, other people's children, right? That's not my problem, or they need to go to ESL class and learn English there, but in my classroom, I'm going to hold them to the same expectations. Not to say we shouldn't have high expectations of our ELLs, but the way you view them sets the tone for how their peers view them and how their peers communicate with them. And so it's really important that we work on our cross-cultural communication skills and set that as an example for their peers, right? Not only about your interactions with the student, but how their classmates are going to. So it's really important, actually, to do pair work, and not only pair work with someone who's maybe at the same level, but sometimes switching it up and giving them a student who is fluent in English and can help them achieve that kind of cross-cultural communication, not only for English purposes, but to learn about each other and understand that all of our opinions are valid and we all have something to contribute. So this attitude towards our students is very important, being warm and genuine and honest with them. And the second thing is establishing a culture of learning. So what does that mean exactly? What do you think a culture of learning is? Could give me a, yeah.
Is it you're teaching them to learn how to learn, like
yeah.
not just like learn this one thing, but like how do you become better at growing and learning everything,
Right. Something that often happens is a student learns what they need to please you, and then they're not really learning, they're just learning to get by. Mm-hmm. And so we want to, as best as we can, create an environment that explains why this is important and why this is relevant, and also show them that you're learning too. So what do you think are some ways that as teachers, we're showing our students that we're also learning, and that this is not just about getting by and our tests, right? I mean, what are some things you should learn as a teacher when you have ELLs in the classroom?
Integrate their own experiences into the content, so hear what they have to say so teachers can learn from their experiences and add it on to their previous knowledge that they already have on the topic.
Right, and that's the big key factor, right? We have to learn about their culture, and we need to learn, and that may mean outside of class also, doing a little bit of research, understanding some things about your student, and then incorporating that into your lesson, and making them able to connect with their background, right? Someone mentioned earlier that a student might feel unintelligent because they can't produce something in English. So for you, it's important if you learn what they already know and then connect it with what you're learning in class. Don't assume that all English language learners have the same background, right? They're coming from different countries, they're coming from different places. They have different home lives. Even if they're from the same country, you know that there's diversity among even your non-ELL students. So something to point out is that most researchers on language acquisition believe that your brain's function is to connect new information with what it already knows, right? So when you learn something, your brain is searching for a way to connect it with something it already knows so that you can retain it and remember it. So if you're teaching in your classroom, you want to be able to do this to your ELLs. They do have knowledge, even if they don't know how to express a certain thought in English. There's something there that you can learn, and you can connect it to their classroom experience. So we're talking about creating a culture of learning. So one thing we can do is to model our tasks. You want to always try and perform what you're expecting from your students first so that they have an example to go by. And this is true for all of your students, but it's especially true for ELLs. If they see you do something and produce something, then that makes it so much easier for them when they're trying to figure it out next, right? So this is one way. What are some other ways that we might create a culture of learning in our classroom? How do we make it so that our ELLs are excited to learn and not hindered?
You can provide verbal and written instructions.
Right, yeah, not just verbally, but written. And that was something we talked about during the IS dialect, right? So many of you said that it was much easier once I put something on the board, right? So don't always assume that everything you say is being taken in. And this is true, again, for all of our students, not only ELLs. good. What are some other ways we could?
I think using a lot of visuals in the classroom,
Yeah,
especially
absolutely.
for beginner ELLs, maybe along with instructions.
Yeah, so maybe it might have helped you too if I had some pictures about my questions, because that would give you context. And not only images, but also bringing in physical objects that have to do with your lesson could be helpful. Sure, thank you. Any other?
Yeah, I think checking for understanding is really important. If you're going off, to saying your lesson to your kids and they don't necessarily understand, it doesn't help. So, like asking them or asking them something relevant to what you just taught them, or ask them to repeat what you said, or something to engage them and get them, make sure that what they're doing is, or that what you're teaching is being absorbed.
Yeah, absolutely. And we want to check for understanding in a very specific way. It might be habitual to just say, are there any questions? And then move on when no one answers you. But actually that silence could mean that they all have a question and they're afraid to ask. So having that are there any questions moment actually might not help. So like you said, repeat. Asking students, can you repeat what I just said in your own words? That would really more specifically gauge, did they get this or did they not get this? And those are really important things to incorporate in our classroom, ways to check for understanding. Okay, so outside of a culture of learning, another thing that's really important for our ELLs is that we do connect with their family and we connect with their community. And again, something important for all of our students, but especially for our ELLs, this will help you to learn their culture, to learn about where they've come from, how did they get here. So this may be something that you feel, oh, we won't have time to do this, but if you really could make the time to go and meet the parents of your students, or create an assignment that allows you to see into their worldview, for example, giving an interview a member of your community, these are ways that you can connect with their families. We don't want to look at their culture or their language as this big hindrance, this something that you have to overcome, but rather we want to embrace it in the classroom and use it, and that will help their learning. Can you think of any other ways that we could include the community in our learning, or include their culture in our learning?
I think it would be important to learn about their cultural behaviors and their body language and just certain nonverbal things to
Yeah,
make
absolutely.
sure that you're not offensive toward them.
That's a good point. Can you think of a way that you might offend a student or misunderstand a student's body language? Or yeah.
I think if you, let's say you're reprimanding a student and you're saying, like, look at me, in some cultures it might be, like they might be taught not to look at their teacher or any authority figure when they're being reprimanded.
Absolutely,
So you're
right.
kind of like trying to break something they've been traditionally like taught.
Yeah, and this means we need to be self-aware of our own culture, right? We need to know what things do I do that are cultural and what things are just classroom. And so if you, for example, do expect your students to look you in the eye and they're from a culture where that's rude, you're going to miscommunicate and something's bound to go wrong. So these are important things to be aware of, right? Classroom behavior, body language. For example, in Korean culture, if I were to hand you a piece of paper with two hands, that means I'm trying to be respectful. So if your student comes up to you with a paper like this and you snatch it with one hand and say, thank you, you've just been incredibly rude to that student and you will never know it. And they'll never tell you. And so it's really important that we do our research, that we find out these things outside of the classroom and then bring them back in. Another important thing might be dress code, how they view time. You may have a student who's late or early or whatever the case may be. Even just the way you dress might speak something to the student that you don't mean to speak to that student, or even the way they dress, you might be confused about it, or they may have something, part of their culture that you should understand. Something else that I'd like to point out in terms of culture is learning to pronounce your students' names. And often your students may choose an English name that might be easier for you to pronounce, which would be the easy way out. But it actually really shows a lot of respect to your student if you try your best to pronounce their name correctly, or even ask them outside of class so that you don't embarrass yourself or them in front of everyone, and practice it, and then try and try and try. And that's their identity. And that also gets added into this lessening their anxiety, right? If you go to another culture and they can't say your name, that means every time the teacher calls on you, you have to be reminded that they can't say your name and you don't really belong here. And it just would really help if you make that extra effort, go the extra mile to do that. Fourth thing, organize safe classroom space. Actually, someone mentioned this earlier, to have things around in their language that they can read and feel comfortable doing so. So it's really important that we have a classroom that's diverse, that diverse materials are available. You're not just shoving one worldview in their face all the time or one way of doing things, but to have a classroom and that represents, we are all from different places. And so I want to say, don't underestimate decorating your classroom and having this sort of multicultural feel to it. Even having something in their language that they can read, it's just a sense of comfort. And it's small, but your kids are always here. They come every day. This may be more so in an elementary school classroom where you do have this capacity, but even in a higher level classroom, just showing that we all come from a different place, and that's okay. These are important things to do. All right, well, thank you for being here today. That's the end of my lesson about ELLs, and I hope this was very informative for you. And again, stay connected, talk to professionals, talk to ELL teachers, get professional development, keep learning always about your students. So thank you for your time, and see you again next week.